Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Command & Conquer Red Alert 3 Uprising for PC, though a portion of it called Commander's Challenge was released on PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. This is the standalone expansion pack to Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. It was developed by EA Los Angeles and released in March of 2009, although the cut-down Commander's Challenge version was released in September of that year. And it's kind of interesting because this takes a pretty radically different approach than the base game does. And it features 4 campaigns instead of the usual 3. This time around, they also threw in a campaign centered around Yuriko, the psionic commando that the Japanese Empire gets in Red Alert 3. And I'll get to that in a moment, but what really is worth noting here is that while the previous iteration, Red Alert 3, had a very mixed reception. Some people really liked it, some people didn't, and you can really just chalk that up more to fan reaction. The reaction to Red Alert 3 Uprising was generally pretty lukewarm to outright negative. So that of course begs the question, well, why were people pretty negative about this one when it was just a fairly mixed reception for the base Red Alert 3, and even though I didn't care for Red Alert 3, I can still see where some people might enjoy some aspects of it. But then you come to Red Alert 3 Uprising. What's so weird about it? Let's find out. Well, as far as presentation goes, there's really not all that much to say about it other than it's pretty much exactly the same as Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. The difference with this one is that they threw in a few new units, and so those are all up to par with the rest of the stuff in Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. And they changed up some of the FMV cast. They now have Malcolm McDowell and Ric Flair, of all people. No! Don't get Ric Flair anywhere near a video game ever again. He's awful. But at least we got Malcolm McDowell, and the rest of the cast that does return does a decent enough job, and the main problem ends up being that there's just not all that many of these cutscenes in there, so you have a pretty limited pool to draw from in terms of what kind of quality they have. They're the same level of visual quality as the cutscenes in Red Alert 3, but the acting is more stiff, it's more awkward, and worst of all, it comes across as almost too corny, which is really weird considering how ridiculous Red Alert 3 was. But that said, the only other real big change in the presentation was the addition of a few music tracks, and some of them are actually pretty good, like Yuriko's theme is actually rather good, but other than that, there's really just nothing to say about it. It's just the same. But where things do get different and things really start to fall apart for this thing are the story and the gameplay. And the story in this is split across 4 campaigns, 3 of which are pretty much what you would expect from Command & Conquer at this point. You have your Soviet campaign, Allied campaign, and your Empire of the Rising Sun campaign, as you did in Red Alert 3. And then you also have the Yuriko campaign, which I'll get to in a moment. But the first campaign you have to play is the Soviet campaign. Why do I say you have to play it? Because you have to beat the first mission of it in order to unlock the Allied and the Japanese campaign. Which is really odd. That's not something that is really a thing in Command & Conquer. I mean, other than the Skrin mini-campaign that was in Command & Conquer 3, but that was more of a bonus than anything else, and when you get to this, the mini-campaigns are the only campaigns this has. Yes, mini-campaigns. The absolute longest of these campaigns is 4 missions, and that's the Soviet campaign. All other 3 campaigns are 3 missions apiece. It's actually kind of insulting. So you really don't have all that much story in this thing. It's basically concerning with Yuriko, it's her backstory and what she did after the war and everything like that. With the other 3 campaigns, you've got the Soviet campaign trying to stop the Allied contractor Future Tech from creating something called the Sigma Harmonizer, which is a super weapon. And then you have the Allied campaign, which is basically trying to go after Imperial commanders who are trying to resist Allied occupation. And the Empire campaign concerns fighting some Soviet generals that are trying to conquer various parts of Japan that are being ignored by the Allied occupiers. And the storylines in this are really not compelling in the slightest, and they're just too short to really get anything out of anyway, so you don't really have much attachment to this. The characters aren't particularly interesting, and so the only one that really stands out is the Yuriko campaign, because it focuses entirely on one character, but it's not because it focuses on that character, it's because it plays completely differently from all the other campaigns, and pretty much anything Command & Conquer for that matter. You see, the gameplay of the other three campaigns is pretty much exactly what you would expect from Command & Conquer at this point. And as far as the challenge mode goes, that is basically just the Commander challenge mode that you had back in Command & Conquer Generals, except now it's in Red Alert 3. So, woo, we're rehashing old things again. But with the Yuriko campaign, you take control of Yuriko herself. The camera is locked to her, and she has 4 abilities that she can use that are on a cooldown timer. And as you go through the various levels, you're going to get access to these terminals that will give you upgrade points that you can spend on passive bonuses, as well as just upgraded versions of your powers. And she can do things like mind control units, specifically human units. She can smash things with her mind by picking them up and throwing at other things. She can create a shield around herself that will actually reflect enemy attacks right back at them. And she also has an ability that lets out this big area effect that pretty much vaporizes any normal human target. And while it's a nice change of pace from what you're used to in Command & Conquer Red Alert 3, it doesn't last long enough or have really enough of a progression to really last. And even worse, they reuse the same location twice in the missions. So you only get basically 2 unique locations when you go through these missions. The first mission, you're in a psychic facility. The last mission, you go back to that facility, although it has a slightly different layout now. But that's just kind of lazy, folks. And the story for it was just so incredibly cliche, and the ending to it was even worse. It quite literally has her stepping in front of a city, and then it just cuts. So it's like, okay, that was underwhelming. And that's what you get through most of these campaigns. They're just incredibly underwhelming. They're only 3 or 4 missions, and they're not even good missions. Even worse, the very first mission you have to go on is the one for the Soviet campaign, and it's an escort mission in an RTS, and you don't have a base to build up. It's infuriating. So, what you have to deal with is 3 campaigns that are just pretty standard Red Alert 3 stuff, only with a really bad start to things in the Soviet campaign, and a unique campaign that doesn't really go anywhere. So what's left? Well, you've got the challenge mode, which again is just rehashed from previous Command & Conquer games, and you've got skirmish mode, which is exactly the same as it was in Command & Conquer Red Alert 3. Still up to 6 players, and that's it. But there's something you should note about this. Unlike in Red Alert 3, there is literally no multiplayer in this whatsoever. You think I'm joking? No, I'm not. Take a look at the menu. There is literally no multiplayer in this. At all. So that one thing that Red Alert 3 did the entirety of the campaigns that made it too easy, well, it doesn't do it anymore, so the campaigns are quite a bit harder now. In fact, they're kind of unfair, partly because there's only 4 missions in the longest one, and so they have to ramp up the difficulty insanely quickly. So now you're stuck with no co-op at all, no versus multiplayer at all, and basically no longevity whatsoever. The new units, well, I guess they're nice, but they're not particularly awesome or anything like that. I mean, the Allies get the Cryo Legionnaire and the Harbinger gunship, which is pretty cool, but they just don't really fit in as well with the stuff that was already there. You're still going to gravitate to the same kind of stuff you were using in Red Alert 3 to begin with. So what's worst about Red Alert 3 Uprising is not only does it rehash things from previous Command & Conquer games, not very well even. Not only is it just more of the same from Red Alert 3, the amount of content on offer here is incredibly minimal, and it has basically no longevity to it whatsoever. I mean, at least Red Alert 3's multiplayer is only down because GameSpy just shut down, but there's no multiplayer in this by design, and if you get this on console, it's even worse because it's only the challenge mode. It's just insulting, especially considering they have the gall to charge $20 for this thing. That's the same price as Red Alert 3. Quite literally, the only time you would even get this game is if you had it bundled with Red Alert 3, like I did. I got it through the Humble Bundle at first, and then I got the Ultimate Collection on Origin, so that's the version I ended up playing. But the only reason I got this game at all was because it was bundled with other stuff. If you got this on its own, I feel bad for you. It is not worth the price of admission. And if Red Alert 3 was disappointing, this just being insulting takes the cake. I give it a 1.5 out of 5. Thanks for watching.